So my name is Paul Culpan. I'm a consultant orthopaedic surgeon here in London. Unlike the previous speakers, my practice is not entirely hips, and I guess my role in being here is to give you maybe a bit of the perspective from the British user's side and somebody with a bit less expertise than was demonstrated in the quite amazing lectures that we've enjoyed this morning from my friends and colleagues from France. So I want to commend them on those quite spectacular talks. My practice is mostly to do with hips, but being at the Royal London Hospital, it's massively influenced by trauma, and I spend a lot of time fixing pelvic and acetabular fractures and doing complex arthroplasty in relation to that, and therefore some revision hip surgery, which is maybe a bit out of the normal. My experience with Symbios is now, I think, about 5 years in, and I guess what I struggle with is the fact that I can't use it all the time. It makes life so easy and makes the surgeon look so good that I don't know if you're feeling it, but I feel nervous about doing a primary hip replacement now when you hear the talks we've just heard. So I think it's important not to lose a little bit of perspective on this. Hip replacements, as we know, are still phenomenally good operations. The success rate is higher than any other operation that we know. It's brilliant at relieving discomfort. Patients love it. They love us as surgeons for delivering that relief of pain. So we're in a really privileged position to be in. What I've discovered in my 5 years of using Symbios is that extra little bit that can be achieved. My primary hip practice in NHS is quite small, and most of the cases I do that I'm able to use Symbios for are therefore in the private sector. So I acknowledge that I'm not necessarily comparing like with like, but the results are just different. And the patients that I'm doing them on are often more demanding, and I don't think would be accepting of a lot of the replacements that we're potentially able to offer to very many of our patients. And the emphasis is all on restoring anatomy, and it's the amount of information that we're given that allows you to be pre-warned and literally be doing a virtual operation before we've touched the patient. So a straightforward primary hip replacement combined with the planning that we've gone through in such detail, and if we're able to add into that a minimally invasive surgical approach, so we're preserving the hip abductors and preserving and respecting the anatomy, is leading to results that very frequently are just phenomenal, and the activity levels that are just, as I said, as I've already stated, different. The shape of the stem is anatomic in all planes. It's made to fit the femur. It's not something that's made to fit an AP radiograph. And so the sagittal view, you can see that anatomic curve to the stem, which means you don't see the anterior thigh pain that you occasionally see with using a straight stem. The recovery you get is different from the French videos. This patient's got some clothes on. So it maybe masks the limp, but this patient's only 13 days after her surgery, and that again is something that's replicated. You're seeing it, and it might be anecdotal, and it is anecdotal from my perspective. Luckily, Dr. Seriali is able to back it up with some science, but the functional results, I think, are reproduced and follow the logic of what's been explained today. And I'm only going to go through a couple of examples today. I'm not going to go into anything like the same depth, so you'll be relieved that lunch won't be delayed. But the emphasis is about firstly recognizing the anatomic variations and then being able to adapt to them. Having the solution that doesn't mean that we're going to get a reamer out and take out more bone, or we're going to put cement in and create the version in ways that we're used to doing and being creative in doing, and generally we're quite good at, but not always. And again, I know from my practice that although hip replacements are great operations, a lot of patients are coming to me having had hip replacements, not entirely happy, and sometimes it's a bit subtle. It's the abductor muscles, sure, they can walk with no limp for 100 meters, but it's those patients after 200 and 300 meters, they're not describing a limp at that point, but they've got the buttock ache. And then they go for longer, and then the limp comes in. And I think what we're seeing there, and I think if you start to ask patients about it more specifically, I think there's much more of it out there than we appreciate, is that we've just not restored the anatomy. The hip abductors are always up against it. We've not given them a fighting chance because we frankly didn't know what their anatomy was before we began. We're relying on our surgical skill to try to do that, and we're generally okay at it. In some ways, amazing how good we are at it when we hear the talks that have gone already today. We all have our techniques of balancing the soft tissues, of using what information an X-ray has to offer us, but it's all very, very limited. And the fact of the matter is that there's a much, much better way of doing this. So we know what the hip abductors do. We know where they go to. We know the importance of them. We have the ability in doing our surgery to alter all of that. We can increase the offset, we can decrease the offset. What we need to do is somehow always get it correct. We know that if we increase the offset, we're increasing the ability of the hip abductors to work. The abduction becomes stronger. And that is something that's entirely within our control. We want to get this right. There's a photo from France. But hip replacement patients are looking for a different sort of, these are not the same patients as we were treating 20 years ago. And a lot of them are looking to get back to a higher level of activity. They're not prepared to wait until they're in their 60s so they can walk without discomfort. And I think that's not achievable unless we respect and recreate their anatomy. Again, I think it all makes sense. It's all recreating anatomy. We know that if we restore the center of rotation of the hip, we know that hip is likely to work better, is likely to last longer. We know the wear characteristics are more favorable. Similarly, restoring the length, restoring the offset I've already flogged and I'll continue to do for a while, and recreating the anatomy such that they have stability and confidence in their hip. If we achieve all of that, the hip feels natural, functions well, and we've truly delivered something that the patient cannot, often cannot believe how good it is. And that I think is achievable on a very regular basis. It's not about just increasing the offset, it's about getting the offset right. If we overdo it, we've heard already in some of the talks this morning, it's been alluded to that it increases the wear, but it's not just about the wear. Again, the patient will tell you that if you increase their offset, they hate it. So if we don't get enough, the hip abductors are not working. They've got the buttock ache after a certain amount of mobilizing. If we overdo it, they seem to tolerate it even to a worse extent. Getting the hip anatomy right is something we've known about for a very long time with regards to the center of rotation. It offers the best chance of the most favorable wear characteristics. This is what we want to avoid. A hip center that's been raised, leg length that's not been reconstructed. It's just not what we're aiming to achieve. It seems so simple. The problem with our radiograph is that our varus hip with a certain amount of rotation can become our valgus hip. So our plain radiograph just does not give us the information that we need, and I think we all totally appreciate that now. And being here today, I guess most of you appreciated it before we arrived here. So there's lots and lots of scope for error. The focus in this is probably just about appropriate, because that's where we're at, right? If we increase the focus and we get nice definition here, we're not really going to get any more information. We don't know where we are with regards to scale. We know, we all appreciate, we've all trained in doing this, that we don't know what size of our acetabular femoral component is going to be. We have some idea perhaps of what shape of femoral component is going to be optimal here, but it's best guess. It's certainly not going to deliver any accuracy. It doesn't mean that we should not be templating, and of course, it's an exercise in engaging our brains, I think, in beginning to think about the operation before we start. So it's not that I would ever advocate that people should not be doing this, but the reality is there's much, much more accurate means of doing this. This is a study that was only published in 2015, looking at the quality of radiographs that we use in two-dimensional templating. And it's a study, I think, from Northern Ireland, and essentially, this is our perfect radiograph. I don't know if any of you recognize it. It's been a long time since I've seen one that looked like that. To get the perfect radiograph, you need to have no pathology, it would seem. It's very hard to achieve. In this study, 94% of the radiographs they deemed were inadequate. And of the 20% that they sent back for a further attempt, only 10% of them came back as what they deemed to be adequate. It seems a bit ridiculous and over the top, but I guess it's just the message being that we're reliant on very, very poor quality radiographs in using a technique that we already know to be suboptimal. The great variation in this, I think, is the external rotation. External rotation is part of the osteoarthritic process. So it's often not possible for the plain radiograph to offer you symmetry. The lesser trochanters are very typically asymmetrical. A perfect plain AP radiograph requires 15 to 20% of internal rotation. Most patients with hip arthritis, I'd argue, are not able to achieve that. It gives us information, and when we don't have the luxury of CT planning, then it's what we have to work with, and we have to combine that with our surgical skills and our experience intraoperatively to get the patient a good result. And of course, it's achievable to get good results, but there's help out there. So defining our anatomy is now possible. It's so simple for us to achieve that. Define the anatomy not just in the hip joint, but in the lower limbs, and take that into consideration. Our leg length discrepancy might not arise from the hip joint. It's very useful to know how much of it arises from the hip joint, because we certainly don't want to compensate for a leg length discrepancy of, for example, the tibia by increasing the length of our hip, of our intra-articular anatomy. So it's great information to have. To identify where your center of rotation is aiming for, and to have the definition of the hip joint that you're going to be able to see intraoperatively is another means of reducing the margin of error, I think. Being able to actually visualize the osteophytes and use them as your references so that you get your orientation of the cup, so you plan how far you're going to ream into the osteophytic bone, you're armed with so much more information to deliver a much, much more dependable and frankly a better job. We've seen lots of modular prosthesis today, and my own practice is almost never to use modularity. The most important feature, I think, of today, in my opinion, using the Symbios system, is in the planning. And what Symbios offers us is that armed with the knowledge of the plan, we'll be able to find a solution to match that anatomy. And nearly always in my practice, that's through one of the two monoblock stems. And when I fail to achieve it with that, then custom-made implants represent a fantastic option. In my practice, I think mirrored with the message of today, it's probably about 15% of cases. Dr. Sariali, as we've heard, has done a phenomenal amount of work, a hugely impressive guy, and he's been able to provide us with information to have confidence in what we've been working with. I've been using this for 5 years, and yeah, I'm a convert. The levels of accuracy that we're able to quote here with regards to restoring anatomy is millimetric. To restore offset and length to within a millimeter or two is such a huge advance on where we were previously. The accuracy in planning the implants that we're going to use is nearly always perfect, and if it's not, it's often because you're tied between two sizes when you've been doing the planning process. So it's not the situation of doing your 2D templating, which was much better 10 years ago than it is now with the digital imaging, where frankly you've got no clue, and you wouldn't know if you're 2 sizes away from what you'd planned, because you just assume that that's all down to the inaccuracies of your radiographs. The scale is determined by the flick of a button. And what's interesting is that the normal anatomy is not really normal anatomy at all. What does that even mean now? But so often the anatomy is reconstructed using a more varus stem than I think we were certainly taught was the more common anatomy and the prosthesis that we use. So in doing straightforward primary arthroplasty, I think it's a great adjunct when it's available to you, and it's not available to me in the NHS, and it's not available to, I'm sure, most of you. But when it is available, I think it's great to have. When you're doing more complicated hips, then it really is a different level of help, and the complexity of these operations is largely alleviated in the planning process and the custom implants that are available to support that. Really hideously complicated cases, again, it'll be real surgical adventures, and to be armed with the information that we have through this process of essentially a virtual operation allows you to anticipate where the disasters are likely to happen and hopefully avoid them, and to be prepared is to be forearmed, and restoring in such complex cases, I think our goals are somewhat compromised, but to get in and out of such a joint, and being able to define the anatomy such that we can anticipate what we're going to be finding at each stage of the procedure is going to be really a huge help. And when the anatomy is so deformed, to have a surgical plan of how to rectify that and at the end of it come out with something meaningful is a huge help. The references that you get intraoperatively with regards to where you sit your prosthesis when anatomy is hugely distorted is a level of help which previously makes you wonder how on earth people could ever have achieved such surgery. This chap's got multiple dysplasia, and he's a dwarf, and he's got terrible bone quality. And he came to me originally from Africa when he was involved in a trauma. He's a 50-year-old lawyer, so I've fixed his bilateral distal femoral fractures, which have healed. So I was really anxious about the shape of his canals, because I've been in there and seen his canals from the distal end. And so it's reassuring to know that a hip prosthesis is actually possible to fit in here. I know you're all wanting to see the post-op, but that's going to have to be for next time. He's coming back in the next few months, but that should be an interesting case. I wanted to touch more, I think, with this afternoon is going to show you a whole series of cases, I think, around pediatrics and obvious deformity. What I wanted to just touch on was not necessarily the cases that you're clear are going to require a custom. So a patient such as this is one of my NHS patients, where this you might not necessarily think too much of. It's a digital radiograph, so scale is not available for us. We don't. It's not used routinely in our hospital, so you get the impression this is a high offset, and probably think little more of it. The guy's big, but he's not exceptionally large. But I just had a hunch, and we did the CT planning, which we have here. I think an Evolution H, I think, is the biggest available. We're taking. There's not a huge amount of deformity. It's just trying to restore the anatomy that we have in front of us. There's nothing more clever than that to it. So taking minimal acetabulum, so we're shortening them up a couple of millimeters by the work that we'll do on the acetabular side. The femoral side, we're losing another 6 millimeters. So we're starting with a size H, which is the very largest available to us, with minimal resection from the acetabulum. The best I can probably possibly achieve is to lose 8 millimeters of length, with an ability to do much worse than that. There's lots of blues in this, which is not a great colour to see, and that implies that maybe the press fit is not great, but it's the largest available to us. And I brought a prop so you can pass that round. So that's the size that actually just doesn't give you an idea of. So thankfully we went for a custom-made stem for him. And what it allows you to do, instead of being at the largest stem available, with the longest neck available, and being at the very end of a system with no scope for any margin for error, and already compromising 8 millimeters in length, it allows you to reset that mark and bring your implant into the middle of the range, so that you can adapt to whatever you may be encountering intraoperatively. And what he wants now is his other side. So we'll be giving him symmetry later this year. And then just finally, I'm just going to talk one more case along a slightly similar theme. So this is a young guy, 37 years old, whose X-ray is, it's pretty underwhelming, isn't it? It's an X-ray that you'd have encountered how many times and thought, nothing much to this. He's 37, so it'd be good to get him just right. You're thinking, okay, maybe a varus stem, right? Nothing to lose sleep over. So this was our best effort at planning this chap. So he planned best with the modular system. So it's a modular, a varus neck, and a +8. So he's at the very end of our options once again. and look what the plan is. Even with that, and certainly varus, long neck, a 37-year-old male, biomechanically we're thinking this is just, this is far from ideal. But even with that, we're 10 millimeters away from being able to restore his offset. And most of it is lost from the acetabular side. Okay, I could be a bit more conservative with that. If I had to wing it, I could probably reduce that if all is going well in the day. But in a 37-year-old, do we want to be doing that? So having this information, cross-sectioning at each point of the where the stem is going, allows you to, again, focus on where to clear your bone. It gives you, it's a massive help intraoperatively. It makes your surgery so much easier. And the stem fits nicely. It's not a problem there. Okay. So in the end, he's gone for our custom stem. And so it gets rid of the surgical adventure. Okay. So, in summary, I think using this system allows you to define your anatomy and then replicate the anatomy. The patients do well. The complication rates, I think, are very low because of that. The patients are very happy. Probably most importantly, the surgeon is very happy. And it becomes very fun surgery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Any questions from the floor? So I'll ask one. So Paul, your practice obviously is you're working at Royal London, and you're managing to get CT scans on these patients, or
yeah. So
how are you predicting who's going to need it?
So, as you know, we've been using this system for a while. So I think once you start to use this system, it makes you think slightly differently and think slightly more and worry much more because of the number of surprises that you get. So just picking up the ones, most of the ones we pick up at the Royal London that we're going for custom are frankly obvious. They're hideous. They've got huge deformity, and they're not borderline cases. The ones I picked out today, and I thought the ones that are more of interest, are the borderline cases. And so it's luck. But how many are being missed because we're not planning? Who knows? But of course, you get away with it. It's not that they're a catastrophe. It's just the thought that one can be doing better.
Richard.
Yeah, Paul. So I've printed about 10 of these now, customs. The way I've sort of got it into the hospital is there's a couple of things. Firstly, pick some wacky cases, and then you can really justify getting the CT scan protocol in. And then once you've got the scan protocol in, you can then quite easily say, oh, I've got this other case, I'm not quite sure, I want to just scan it. And you can start to sort of build up a bit of momentum by, scanning some wacky cases and then getting more and more of the sort of less wacky cases through. And the other thing from an NHS perspective is, because it's a custom implant, you don't have to pay for it as a hospital. And I don't know if that's true in every trust, but certainly in our trust, when we do a custom implant, the cost of that is passed through to the NHS centrally, so the trust gets the same tariff payment, but doesn't have to pay for the implant. And so the trust actually, it makes money for the trust.
Good point.
Any other questions? Okay, so